Hi, Sai. Sara Gutu Unege Sabira. We're going to begin with a quick performance. Joseph Kamiya will be playing Uta Sanshin, Uta meaning singing, and Sanshin, which is a traditional three-stringed Okinawan instrument. So please enjoy. As vast is the night sky, so is his forgetting. A man so lost he is not permitted sleep. Each night comes and he is thrown from the barracks into this ocean of sand. There are no clouds in the sky, and still the stars don't shine. Sounds of English and Japanese are broken glass, dust shards clogging his lungs. Classmates mocking, laughs that cursed him with a broken tongue, broken island, broken boy. Thrown back and forth in bewilderment. Last night they hung him, Shimanshu boy, island still wet on his tongue. On a pole in the mess hall, all the mainland Naichi boys. Together they tossed leftovers and excrement until he was coated in shame. Drowning in his tears, their fears, he understands his loneliness, carves it into his wrists as non-existence. The desert is silent, and so are his ancestors. Future ones came and rescued the others, but he waits in purgatory, screaming and screaming. Watashima yama yaga. Wata uya mayaga. The last speaker of his language left alive.
맞이야 아산 요산 연나
It is a python far from home, escaped from a ship that traveled from Guangdong to Okinawa, freeing itself in the ports of California, sent eastward into the desert horizon. The snake finds the boy's body and begins to wrap himself around what will soon become a corpse, constricting his pain, devouring his sadness. 75 years later, I return to the desert, to this memorial for incarceration, and find their bodies, the boy and the snake embracing in windswept dunes, flesh still rotting, and as if waiting for me, the snake's skin slips free from bone, and like some old ancestral psalm, I fashion it taut over my water canister, and the boy's hair becomes strings that stretch from neck to tip, as Sanshin conjured from teachings that time forgot, a memory lodged somewhere else, and I begin to pluck the strings. And with the sad song, rain begins to pour down, that once in a decade torrent, and this arid desert might as well be Tomigusku or Kintown or Chatan, for the monsoon has obscured all proof of place. And as a cactus bloom, a song springs forth. And from the corners of Manzanar and Rower and Jerome and Poston, a weight is lifted on every Shimanchu soul silenced.
소리 아가리 오친 가지 동묘로 아야하비로 소리 사사 소라사 하이야 소리 맞이요 마티하 이로 이아이 와네 단노마 소리 사사 소라사 하이야 소리 아가리 아카가 이바 윤노아 히티토모티 소리 사사 소라사 하이야 소리치지도 노차가 요로 구이시야 환 소리 사사 소라사 하이야
All right, so hello everyone. My name is Sho. I'm coming to you from Wasanich and Lekwungen territories, colonially known as Vancouver Island. I want to start with this little poem. They tell me that the medicine you need is usually growing near you, just waiting for its purpose to be known. My hope is you'll find it and choose to soothe yourself with its prayers and protection. And that's by Papayaka, who's a Wasanich and a Chanoth healer. And I want to start with that poem because I think it does a lot of things. I think in the journey of returning home and returning to history and finding histories that have been buried and covered, it's really important that we start where we are. And oftentimes, I think we think that there's nowhere to go, there's nowhere to look, we've lost everything. And I think that's especially true when we're looking for Okinawan histories often. And these words, I think, remind me that there's always a place to begin, and that there's always somewhere to start in terms of undoing what's been forgotten. I also think that these words show us that we're really indebted to the people whose land we're on, and to do and embark on these journeys without listening to the elders and the caretakers of the lands that we reside on, that we're visiting, that we're doing work on, it's really a useless struggle. And so I want to uplift these words and say that as Utsinanchu, as Okinawans, when we begin to find our histories, that I think that it's crucial that we do it in conversation with Indigenous people whose lands we're on. And this is difficult work, it's lifetimes. There's been a lot of silences, a lot of erasures, and a lot of segregation. But if we believe and have that intention as a collectivity, I think that we'll start and we'll do something beautiful. So, I think in the Japanese American community, we have had a lot of conversations about racism and discrimination, but I'm not sure we're always so much talking about what colonization is. And I think that's partly because, when we take our name, Japanese Americans, both those words that make it up, Japan and America, are very colonial countries. And so it's often those who are affected by colonization who have to talk about it. And so as Japanese Americans, we're actually often the people who are the colonizers in back home in Japan, but also in the diaspora as Americans and as Japanese Americans. And so to begin to really grapple with Indigenous histories in America, in this continent, but also with Okinawan and Ainu histories, I think it's really important that colonization becomes a center of our analysis and our world. So I wanted to sort of bridge the ocean with two examples of colonization. The first one is Little Tokyo, Tongva territory, colonially known as Los Angeles. I think that we've sort of seen our ethnic enclaves as places of, as a persecution where we've experienced racism. But, if you look at downtown Los Angeles, Little Tokyo is one of the most prosperous ethnic neighborhoods. And it's really an example of a place where Japanese people have come. They've taken land without consent and without dialogue with Indigenous peoples, and they've built things for capital and for capital gain. And so Tongva territory is invisible, basically, when you go to Little Tokyo. And so I think that, colonization, we don't need to look far, and it doesn't necessarily need to be something that's super like, it's always violent, but it's not necessarily always going to be this thing like, like the war and these intense stories. It's really the mundane ways that we live our daily lives. And so, I really want to begin to see how we as a community can start to see that as we've settled on the West Coast and across this continent, that we've done so without the consent of Indigenous peoples. And I think that to really do Okinawan history justice, we need to understand what that means in a context of the lands we live on. And so the other picture on the right is a picture of Henoko. Henoko this is Ora Bay. Ora Bay is a coral reef, which is being reclaimed sort of as we speak. It's in Nagoshi in the Yambaru in northern Okinawa. Henoko is sort of one of the bases that they fought against, they're still fighting against, and is an example of the US colonization of Okinawa, the Japanese colonization of Okinawa, which has been ongoing. I don't know how much you know about the histories of Okinawa, but a good third of the island or something, I don't know the exact percentage, but a large part of the island is occupied by US military bases. And so colonization is a process that has affected almost every country in the world. And I think sometimes it's easier to see the ones that are far away. But, you know, I encourage us as Japanese Americans to look in our community and look in our world and ask, you know, how are we complicit in this? And how does this affect Indigenous peoples? Because the construction we have right now of Japanese Americans, it's at the expense of whoever Indigenous people's land we're on. It's at the expense of Uchinanshu people. And by the way, so Okinawan is sort of the prefectural name. Uchinanshu is in Uchinaguchi, the language. Shimanshu is another way to say more broadly the people of the islands around Okinawa. And so, you know, colonization is a process that makes up the very fabric of our daily lives. And so, you know, we talk a lot about property and property that was taken from us and land that was taken from us, but we don't necessarily talk about how that land was never obtained through proper consent with Indigenous peoples. And I think that if we want to reconcile with our history and we want to build solidarities, as I think is something that people talk a lot about today, then it's really crucial that we don't just say, oh yeah, I support Indigenous people, but that we say, we really look at, you know, deconstructing our lives. And I think that, you know, that solidarity, it's, you know, it's nice to support struggles or whatever, but what it really comes down to is returning land back. And Indigenous peoples have been deprived of their land, and and through that depriving of land, the health has really declined in a lot of communities, and it's through giving land back en masse that we can begin to rectify what history has created. So yeah. So erasure. I think that you know, there's been so much work on the incarceration. There's been so much work on the incarceration, you know, and I think especially in the last years, but, you know, I've been lucky to hear about it my whole life. And I think the narratives got a little stuck. And so we kind of keep hearing the same story over and over again. And so I was really curious. I was like, oh, you know, what were Okinawans experienced during the war? You know, there were probably thousands. I don't have statistics because these things weren't collected, but there were probably thousands of Okinawans in the different camps. You know, definitely lots that came from Hawaii who were incarcerated on the mainland, ones in Southern California and Northern California, and a lot of the Peruvians and people who came up from South America as part of the prisoner exchanges were also Okinawan. And so when I went to go look, I was like, okay, what are the collective histories? It was like silence. It was a very eerie thing where I could, you know, I'd see Okinawan names here and there. I'd you know, it's kind of like when I ask what's the history of the land, the Indigenous people whose lands Japanese have settled on, there's this silence. And so, and it's not that these histories don't exist and they're not real and living and emotive. It's that the dominant people have erased them and have a lot of stake in keeping them quiet. And so I want to begin with this quote. It's from Ben Kobashigawa, who's a retired San Francisco State professor. He's an Okinawan. He wrote and translated the history of Okinawans in North America, which is sort of like one of the crucial texts that I've relied on to sort of redo history. But this is actually a preface to Paul Kochi's memoir. Paul Kochi is one of the initial wave of Okinawans who actually came up from Mexico. And this is how Ben Kobashigawa intros his story. There was a long-standing view in Japan that Okinawans were primitive and backward, or quaint people, which became an active prejudice far away from Japan in areas of immigrant contact. Yet it would be wrong, I think, to put very much emphasis on the differences and relations between Okinawans and other Japanese. Time has eroded the difference, which in any case has little meaning in American context. And so this here is an Okinawan basically saying that we're destined to die. We are destined to be destroyed. And I think this is a really common narrative with Indigenous peoples around the world, is that, you know, we may have existed, and we can, you can have that sort of like thing in a museum or a cultural dance, but that the actual like living relations between people are, that maybe, and I think Ben goes on to say that, they're important for the Issei, for the Nisei, Sansei, for me, Yonsei, 4 generations in, that difference becomes, irrelevant. And that's a really sad premise, because it basically sets us up for genocide. And so I think that part of the work of this presentation and part of the work of Okinawans, wherever we are, is to fight this erasure. And it's an erasure that we have taken and internalized, because we listened to what the Japanese people said, and we said, oh yeah, we don't need to exist anymore. And so I really want to sort of collectively combat that, and that this presentation is sort of my way of coming to the ancestors and saying, hey, like, you existed in camp, didn't you? What was that like? So next slide, please. So this is a picture of Taro Yamashiro. Taro is my great-grandfather. Taro Yamashiro came from Taminato, which is a small village in the northern Yambaru region of Okinawa. Taminato in the local language, which is not Uchinaguchi, because Okinawa is comprised of many different languages, and that's another sort of difference that's been disappeared over time. But so Taminato's name in the language is Tanna. So my family actually says they're Tannanshu. So, I would sort of pose this question, like, Tannanshu is a very specific identity that comes from a village and a land. How did all the rest of us just become Japanese? And what was it that allowed us to take on a nation instead of a place that was connected to a specific land and a specific memory of land? And what have we lost? Because I think that to call ourselves Japanese is often to rely on symbols of imperialism, of militarism, of these sort of things. And it takes away sort of the agency of our connection to a specific place. So, what does it mean to be Tannanshu and be in the camps during the war? That's something that I didn't know, and I still am sort of working through. But I also want to say, so Taro came, he came and settled, first he went to Mexico, but then he settled in the Imperial Valley. The Imperial Valley was settled as part of a land settlement project. It was called, there's all sorts of colonial words being used. And so Okinawan immigrants were part of a project to take land from sort of the patterns of that indigenous people had been using it and harness it for farming, and farming for capitalism, farming for making mass production, farming for making mass capital gain. And so what happens is when Taro settled, his sort of the solidarity that could have existed between indigenous peoples in Okinawa and in the Imperial Valley in Southern California was destroyed. And that's often because maybe the resources weren't there. There's many reasons, but I think it's just very important that now that when we look back in history, that we realize that erasure that's happened. And what happened to our collective identity? What happened to us being able to gather together as Okinawans in camp? It feels like there's been this complete fracturing. And so you have one Okinawan over here, but most of the narratives that I first found are really super like Japanese American patriotic narratives. And I think it's often because people didn't have the space to feel the emotions and feel the sort of different kinds of oppression that really lived in every part of life. And so now it's our responsibility to go back into history and start to add nuance, because first Japanese Americans collectivity was destroyed, and Japanese Canadians, I'm coming from a Canadian context, there's no more Japantowns, and so there's a lot of that was destroyed, but now we're building that. But there's still lots of other things, lots of other collective identities that have been destroyed, and we need to listen deeper. So what about queer LGBT folks in camp? What about sex workers? What about Okinawans, other indigenous peoples? Like there's like the big narrative, and there's always something underneath. And so I think that to maintain that sort of vigilance of keeping working and keeping pushing, because there's always sort of a silence underneath the silence, and there's a lot of emotions there. And so these are things that our ancestors need relieved. And so by returning to them, we begin to air out sort of what history lost. I think of it sometimes as a garden hose, and a garden hose gets that kink in it and the water can't go through. And so it all builds up in one place. And so, as we work with history, instead of just looking for facts and dates and names, I think what we're doing is this active process of saying, let the water flow again, like let our ancestors come back into themselves. And so we do that for ourselves, but then we also listen, how can we support Indigenous people whose land we're on? How can we do that in a better way? There's not one easy answer. And the way world has been set up is not in a good way. And so, but that's, I think, our challenge. Okay. Next slide, please. So Wesley Wensen, who's a professor at San Francisco State, sent me this affidavit from Kiyoshi Kinjo. Kiyoshi Kinjo was a prisoner at Tule Lake who was in Kibe Nisei. He grew up in Okinawa, in Shuri, in Okinawa a little bit, but then came back and was incarcerated in Tule Lake. So he says, everybody in my block 66 knew I was Okinawan. This made everybody look at me with suspicion. Japanese people look on Okinawans as inferior people. So Japan always watched Okinawans in Okinawa. And so Japanese watch me in camp, and it make my life miserable. And if I don't watch my step and renounce like they try to force everybody to do, I know some of the Dan will take it out on me. And so he's speaking from the really militarized Tule Lake context, where there's a whole bunch of pressure to renounce his citizenship, American citizenship, from militant Japanese nationalists. And so, I think that when we look at Tule Lake, there's these two competing nationalisms. There's American nationalism and there's Japanese nationalism. And, oftentimes we had to choose a side. But the thing is what about Okinawans? Where do they fit in all of that? And of course, some of them chose that side, but Kiyoshi Kinjo was unique in that he said that actually, as an Okinawan, he couldn't fit into either of those worlds. And so he, in this affidavit where he's trying to stay in America, basically, he's talking about the pain that he experienced and the bullying. And so this quote really shows, I think, that the past quote of Ben Kobashigawa, where he says, okay, we're just erasure, we're just disappearance, that actually these things really mediated everyday life. And so, Okinawans probably lived very segregated lives in the camps, but we don't really have many narratives of this. This is actually the first thing that I could find of Okinawans actually speaking about their experience as Okinawans in camp, not just people with Okinawan names or whatever. And so, it really, and I think it shows also that, these things aren't just on one level. It's emotional, it's spiritual, it's psychological, it's political, it's cultural. And so, in a place like Tule Lake, where it's already a very heightened context of violence and intensity, as an Okinawan, that trauma gets passed down. And I think what happens is, I think in my family, is like the camp's narratives are silenced. And so, you don't talk about being Japanese American, but you also don't talk about being Okinawan. And it just sort of lingers there and it sort of sits there. And so you never quite fit in with community, but you never have any way of like claiming something of identity. And so I think that when I read this, I was super relieved to see that it was actually really real. That discrimination that we felt, that poem that I wrote, that these things were not something that I just concocted because I wanted to feel pain, that they were actually the historical sort of inheritance. Next slide, please. So here's just two more quotes. Living with such roommates whose social psychological conditionings were different in such a tense pro-Japanese residence created daily tense emotional atmosphere against me as an Okinawan. I never thought of the Japanese emperor as being a descendant of God. Nobody from Okinawa believes in that fairy tale of emperors being related to mythical sun goddess. And so I think that oftentimes, it's like we've been bombarded by American nationalism sort of in the diaspora, but Japanese nationalism is no more healthy. And so, I think people who rejected the American way if they took up Japanese nationalism, even if it was in America, that's just as damaging. And so I thought it was really interesting that he specifically in this affidavit listed and underlined the fact that he didn't believe in that sort of mythical, violent imperialist narrative that is, the Japanese emperor. And I think that's so refreshing because we don't hear that narrative, especially in the wartime. And it's a narrative that's hurt a lot of people, and it's still sort of lurking there. Like, the emperor isn't quite what it was, but we still celebrate that in our community. We still haven't quite reconciled what that means and what that means to Okinawans, but also what that should mean to indigenous people here and people all over Asia. All right, next slide, please. All right, so this one is courtesy of Ako Castoera. So I'm really grateful from sharing. She shared with me these photos and also a memoir from her grandmother, Yeiko Dakuzaku Goya. And this is a quote from Oakland, California. With father away so much, it was mother's lot to raise us properly. She was sensitive to being regarded as lowly Okinawans among the Japanese community and neighbors. Finger pointing came easily with everything we did wrong. She did very well protecting us from feeling inferior in this way. What seemed odd was our last name. In English, it can be read phonetically, but in Japanese, the characters could not be read correctly, and at times it got to be very embarrassing. So in this context of erasure, where we don't have memory, where we've lost so much, a lot of times when I approach people, I'm like, hey, did you have ancestors in camp that were Okinawan? They say, yeah, but then let's not talk about that still, or let's, I don't know. They were there, but they never talked about that part. So we can't talk about the story. So I was really grateful that Ako had this really amazing sort of history. And what she's holding is a suitcase, or there's probably a traditional Japanese name, but I don't know. But it's from her family in Shuri in Naha, and they brought it over, and then they had it in the Bay Area, and then they brought it to Jerome in camp in Arkansas. And then after the war, they brought it with them, and then she was gifted it. And so what we have is this really beautiful physical heirloom that connects and weaves through all of those historical memory points that have been taken away from us. And so I think that suitcase, it's a simple object, but how many things really made it from Okinawa through the camps into our possession now today. And so she had a picture of that on her social media, and I was like, oh my God, like can we use that, because I think it shows a presence, and it shows a continuation of something that has been destroyed. And so and you can see in that next slide, please. You can see that it's something that it holds so much history. And so you can see the inscription there. It says Jerome, Arkansas. And so actually what's interesting is her family after the war changed their names because of that shame. And so this sort of shame and persecution, something that we've thought of maybe as happening in Hawaii or in Okinawa 100 years ago, was happening after the war in America. And so she says, in the meantime, Shige, grandma's brother, in Tokyo, researched the family history and discovered that the name Fukuhara had been used at one time by his ancestors. He consulted the Iwaharas and other relatives in Tokyo, and they thought it was a good name to change to. So Shige did. Meanwhile, in Oakland, Hide and our parents decided to use the O from Oroku, mom's surname, and the Da from Dakuzaku to read Oda. And so, what does it mean to change your name, and change your name not because you wanted a new name, but because it was too shameful to have your old name? And so Dakuzaku, it's a beautiful name, but it's not a name that can be understood in Japanese. And so because I think of the competing oppressions of Japanese and American things that were going on at the time, they changed it to Oda. And so I think that that's a really good metaphor for the silencing that has happened over the generations. And so I really want to sort of hold that up as something that, it's not far from our community relations. When we talk about the wartime, when we talk about that post-war time, like Okinawans and the shame and the emotional like burden is something that is carried with us and we continue to carry with us. And I think it's just now that a lot of older generations of people are able to explore that and ask, what were my grandparents? What were they not able to hold? And, in some ways it's similar to the shame that was created by the Japanese American incarceration. But what's different is that one of the main generators of that shame was the Japanese American community. And so the medicine for curing Japanese American incarceration is not the medicine for curing the Okinawan sort of discrimination that happened. And so that's, I think, why the silence has been so profound over the years. And so, I think that we're at a time where it's like, how do we reconcile that relationship? And it is a relationship. And so, there's a relationship happening in the diaspora, between Okinawans and between mainlanders. And I think for the most part, mainlanders act like Okinawa's a nice place. They have a different culture. But I'm like, no, I'm actually asking in a real way, like, how are we going to relate to each other? What does reparations look like? What does existing in a better way look like? And so, I think that, to have that family story and to hold this suitcase, I think it shows, though, that things did survive and genocide is never complete. And so even though we might say we will be erased and we might say we will be destroyed and other people might say we will be destroyed, if we believe in returning, if we believe in being reborn, it's possible. And so that's something that I hold very dear. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so this is Hideo Kobashigawa. Hideo Kobashigawa was born in Arizona and then went back to Okinawa, and then he came back and was incarcerated, I think, at Tule Lake and Manzanar. And this is a painting he did. And I just think it's, I actually talked with an academic in Okinawa who had written a bit about his work and the colors of Okinawa in the mountains. You can see the colors. That's just sort of another example of how subtly, and often it's like, it's sort of like in queer community, you have to use codes, you have to say things without actually saying them. And so that was his way, perhaps through his artwork, of conjuring the island. And I think that, if we really could go back to the camps, we could see that there's all sorts of subtle codes that were used to conjure islands and to conjure Okinawa back in the mainland context. But unfortunately, because of the way the archive of history has worked, a lot of those things have been destroyed. But we can always begin somewhere. And so I think to see Hideo Kobashigawa's artwork was super, I don't know, I just felt like I could see that journey from Okinawa to America, to the camps, and I could see it encapsulated in this painting in a way that I thought that, I was like, did that even happen? Like, were my ancestors real? Did they exist? And so I can see it in this painting, and that makes it very clear. So next slide. So this is a quote. This is actually a letter that Hideo wrote. The snow-capped mountain range behind us is majestic. The people in their different clothes are beautiful, especially the young girls. There's a bewildering amount of material to sketch everywhere. I brought $20 worth of paints and plenty of canvas and drawing paper. That's what I intend to do. Drawing is free. Please give me about 8 D5 pens for pen and ink drawing, 2 more of a larger size, 3 C6s, and 3 other larger ones, 1 India ink and Waterman paper in book form. And so that's just, it's not a super significant quote, but I thought it was just, it was kind of cute. And you see how, art really was his refuge in the time, and that art was a place that he was able to hold the island. And I think that, if we really look back into each of our ancestries, even if we didn't have the space or to pass the memories down, there are these sort of little spots where we can return to life, where we can return to existence. And I think that, to go back to the original quote, start with where we are. And if we start where we are, we'll start to see that there's medicine growing around us, and there's medicine that can bring our stories into life. And sometimes we have to create them. And it's mythology. History is always myth. History always has some element of the supernatural and the unreal. And so I think as Okinawans, when we want to look back at something like the wartime years when so much has been destroyed, that we fall into that and we don't try and rely too much on the mind, that we let the heart and the spirit bring us to a place where we allow history to unfold. All right, so I'm at my time, but I'm gonna pass it over to Anne Tamaki Dion, who's gonna share her family story, and then after that, Jane Yamashiro will share her family story. So thank you very much.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here today. I'm Okinawan on my father's side. I was born after the war. I have two siblings, my older sister Ellen and my brother Don. We all grew up in Oakland. I'd like to tell you a little about my grandfather, Kamaichi Tamaki, and my grandmother, Tsuruyo Ishikawa, here in the photo. A little family history might be helpful in connecting the Okinawan community to the camp experience. My grandfather left Okinawa in 1906 to escape the draft. He refused to serve in the Japanese Imperial Army. Okinawa was a poorest prefecture, and Okinawans felt that the Japanese government treated them like second-class citizens. Instead of waiting to be drafted, he signed on as a contract laborer and went to Hawaii, leaving behind a wife and 3-month-old daughter. He worked for a time as a plantation worker and then stowed away on a merchant ship headed for Eureka in Northern California. Eventually, he worked his way south to San Francisco. While doing day jobs, he learned to cook Western style and made a living as a cook until he was able to start a business operating a hotel in San Francisco with his wife, who joined him in 1917. The hotel was called the Fuji Hotel here in the picture. It's the original Fuji Hotel in 1923 before any renovations. When my grandfather purchased this property on Buchanan Street to house the hotel, he registered legal title in the names of his underage son, born in 1918, my father, and a daughter born in 1921. Under the 1913 California alien land laws, only citizens had the right to own property. And here's a photo of the Tamaki family taken in the parlor of the Fuji Hotel. And next we see a photo of the Okinawan Kenjinkai meeting at the Fuji Hotel. My father, Min, was the eldest son and the firstborn in the United States. He had 4 siblings. In 1942, my grandmother and her 5 children, mostly adults, were removed to Tanforan and Topaz. My grandfather died in 1939, so he was spared from internment. At the time, my father was in his last semester at UC Pharmacy School in San Francisco. While in camp, my father worked as a pharmacist. He was allowed to leave Tanforan to take the California State Licensing Examination. He worked as a pharmacist in both Tanforan and Topaz. He was in the first contingent, which left Tanforan in September 1942 to set up medical facilities in Topaz before the rest of the Topaz incarcerees arrived in October. And this is a photo of my father's UC diploma mailed to his Tanforan Forstall address. While in Topaz, my father met and he married my mother, Io Yamashita. She was not Okinawan. Her mother was from Tokyo, and her father was from Naigi near Nagoya. And here's a picture of Min and Io taken after their wedding. On their honeymoon in Salt Lake City, my father signed up for a welding course. Welding was considered an essential wartime skill. So when he was promised a job in Chicago, he was granted leave clearance permission for him and his wife to leave camp. Upon arriving in Chicago, my father found Anise there who was willing to take the welding job, and he looked for a job as a pharmacist. But no one was willing to hire Japanese. So he and my mother went to Philadelphia, where my mother's sister worked for the Quakers in the National Student Relocation Council NSRC program, which placed Nises into colleges. With his UC diploma in hand, my father got a job as a chemist in Philadelphia until 1944, when he then received his draft notice. I was born in Framingham, Massachusetts. My father worked as an army pharmacist there. We moved back to California in 1948, the year I was born, because my father was the eldest son, and it was his responsibility to care for his widowed mother. I grew up traveling across the bay every Sunday to have dinner at the Fuji Hotel with my grandmother, aunts, uncles, and cousins. We sat at the long boarding room table, and I still vaguely recall on the dining room wall a black and white aerial photograph of a walled-in property. I never knew until I was an adult that this was a 1939 pre-war image of my grandmother's home in Shuri, Okinawa. And here's a picture of the Shuri home of my grandmother. At the end of that same dining room, I didn't know that the painted portrait of the white-haired, long-bearded old man in clothing that looked more Chinese than Japanese was my great-grandfather. And this is a photo of the painting of great-grandfather, whose name was Kana. I didn't know that the ozoni my aunt made every New Year's morning was a traditional Okinawan recipe. Nor was I aware that the banjo-like instrument in the hotel parlor was a Sanshin, an Okinawan samisen that belonged to my grandfather. So why didn't I know these things? I might say that it was because my mother was not Okinawan, so we didn't emphasize what was Japanese versus what was Okinawan. I might say that my father admitted he was not interested in his Okinawan heritage until he was older, way past retirement, when I asked about my grandfather. My father had bypass surgery at age 75, and I was there helping during his recuperation, and he began to tell me stories of his visit to Okinawa when he was 9 years old. This is when I decided to save his stories for my children. And this is when I appreciated what a great storyteller he was. But back to the focus of this discussion on Okinawans in camp. They were there, but I didn't think to ask my father specifically about Okinawans in camp when I interviewed him. So I don't have much information to share in this regard. However, what I can say is that I knew my father's friends post-camp during my childhood, and I realize now who was Okinawan. For example, we called Jane Yamashiro's uncle, Uncle Hank, like he was our uncle, although he was no relation, only a very close friend. We saw him on a regular basis. He was in camp, and I'm sure my father saw him while they were both there. I know now that the Yamashiro family comes from the same neighborhood in Shuri as the Tamakis. The basis for my father's friendships goes back to the immigrant years, when Okinawan families gravitated to each other. The one story I did hear about Okinawans in camp came to me while working on the Topaz Museum project. To give you a little background on my connection to the Topaz Museum, I visited Delta, Utah again in 2013, and I met Jane Beckwith, who now serves as Topaz Museum Board President. I was inspired by Jane's energy and dedication, so when I was later asked, several months later, to help, I formed a support group composed mainly of Topaz descendants, which became the Friends of the Topaz Museum. Now back to my Okinawans in camp story. In the midst of planning the grand opening of the Topaz Museum, we held many meetings and were always exchanging camp stories. On one occasion, Chizu, a Nisei, told us about the young people in camp. She said there was no privacy, so sometimes the camp ambulance was used by couples to make out. So at the time, my father was 23 in Topaz. Chizu was 19. She said, all the girls thought your dad was so cute. She then paused before adding, but then he was Okinawan. I didn't have to ask her what that meant. The same prejudice that existed before camp continued in camp. Chizu was being honest, and her remark was very illuminating. That concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Jane Yamashiro, and I'm speaking to you from Berkeley, which is in the territory of Huichin, part of the unceded land of the Chochenyo Ohlone, the successors of the sovereign Verona Band of Alameda County. The title of my short presentation today is Wondering About Okinawan Experiences in Camp. I started out wanting to title this Okinawan Experiences in World War II Incarceration Camps, but I realized I'm really asking more questions than I am providing answers, so I'm going to leave it at wondering about. Let me start off, next slide please. Let me start off telling you a little bit about my family background. My grandparents on my father's side were from Okinawa, and on my mother's side, her grandparents, my great-grandparents, were from Nara. So I grew up knowing that my grandparents, that my family was Okinawan on one side and from Nara on the other side, and I grew up identifying as Japanese American, sort of seeing it in these ways. Now I would describe myself as Sansei Okinawan and Yonsei Japanese. So how did I learn to see it this way? Next slide, please. It was really moving to Hawaii that changed the way that I thought about my Okinawan background. I moved there in 2000 to attend graduate school. And I was there to do graduate work, write a dissertation on Japanese American experiences in Japan. So I was curious about Japanese Americans in Hawaii. I'd always heard that something different was going on there. And so I attended a lot of community events to just sort of see. And as I would attend these events and I'd get to the point where I'd meet people and introduce myself, I'd say, hi, my name's Jane Yamashiro. And over again, people would respond to that by saying, oh, so you're Okinawan. And that confused me because I didn't know how they could figure it out just based on that information. I soon learned that Yamashiro is a very typical Okinawan name and that there are Okinawan names. I didn't even know that. As I would continue the conversation and say, well, my father's family is from Okinawa, my mother's family is from Nara, then time and time again, people would say, oh, so you're half Okinawan and half Japanese. And that really got me thinking because I had always seen Okinawan as a more specific kind of Japanese, not as different from Japanese. So I wondered if you could be described as half Okinawan and half Japanese, then what does it mean to be Okinawan and how is it different from being Japanese? So while I was living in Hawaii, I learned about Okinawan experiences there, the history of discrimination and settlement, plantations, and I learned a lot and it was really interesting. But then I realized that, Okinawan experiences in the continental United States, like those of my grandparents and my Okinawan relatives, must have been different. So I was curious, but I was, like I said, I was in Hawaii to do graduate work on a different topic. So I finished that work, finished my dissertation, revised that into a book, published that in 2017. And so since then, I've been doing a research on what it means to be Okinawan on the US continent. So far, I've conducted over 50 interviews with people of Okinawan heritage who are currently living on the US continent. So they've been born and raised in various places. And I've conducted over 2 years of ethnographic field work, attending different Okinawan events and meetings, just seeing like what people are doing and how they're talking about and thinking about being Okinawan here. Unfortunately, by the time I started doing this research, my father had passed away and all of his siblings, my grandparents. So the family on the Okinawan side, I'm not able to ask them questions, but I have all these questions myself, and it's really interesting to do this research. So I'd been thinking about all of this when Sho invited me to be part of this panel, and it's an honor to be part of this conversation. Next slide, please. When he asked me what I knew about Okinawans in camp, or he knew that he had heard from Wesley that I had a family history in camp, the first thing that came to mind was this photo that I'd come across. So this is a photo of Okinawans taken in the Topaz incarceration camp in Arizona. It was not handed down to me through family. I know about this photo because it was published in the centennial celebration of Okinawan immigration booklet, published in 1996 to commemorate Okinawan immigration to San Francisco and the surrounding areas. It was put together by the Okinawa Kenjinkai of North America, which is now known as the San Francisco Okinawa Kenjinkai. And I really don't have a lot of context for this photo. I just came across it in this booklet. According to the caption, it was taken around 1944 in the Topaz camp, a gathering of Okinawans. And the photo was provided by my Auntie Mary, but like I said, I'd never had the chance to speak to her directly about this photo. So when I look at this, a couple things come to mind. One is, people took the time to take this photo. They're sitting in chairs, they're dressed up, people are in suit and, in ties and dresses. And so there was a significance to gathering and commemorating with a photo this group of Okinawans together in camp. And, to me, that means that it meant something to be Okinawan. What that meant, what it was like to be Okinawan in camp, I don't really know. I have a lot of questions. It was great to see the documents and stories that Sho's been able to collect, and to hear bits and pieces here and there. But I think really this is the beginning of a conversation of trying to figure out, what were people thinking and feeling and experiencing, and how was being Okinawan, like, what did that mean? How was it different from people of just Japanese descent in the camps? Next slide, please. So I want to just say a few things as a sociologist, as a researcher. When I can't answer these questions fully, but I can try to piece together a few things. So when I ask the question, what did it mean to be Okinawan in the continental U.S. during World War II? The first thing that comes to mind for me is thinking about identity construction. What I know is that identities are constructed through a combination of how other people see us and how we see ourselves. So there's two different processes going on at the same time. Sometimes they're seamless when they match, and other times there's a huge gap when they're very different. Okinawan immigrants in the US in the 1940s probably identified as ethnically Okinawan, maybe using different terminology, but as not Nihonjin or not Japanese. Why do I think this? Because in short, without going into Okinawan history, I'm still learning a lot of it myself. Okinawa didn't come into existence as a prefecture. There was no Okinawa prefecture prior to 1879. Previously, what existed in that land, it was called the Ryukyu Kingdom. And there, people didn't speak Japanese. They spoke other languages. They had different cultural habits. And historically, Okinawans or Ryukyuans, Uchinanshu, Shimanshu, however you call them, they were seen as different from Japanese. So in the US, I'm just going to wrap up my last minute here. In the US during World War II especially, people were labeled and treated as Japanese, constructed as a different race. Okinawans came to the US using Japanese passports, and there's always been this assumption that Japanese citizens are ethnically Japanese. But last slide. Last slide, please. Oh, thanks. But just to wrap up with a final thought, why is it so hard to find narratives about Okinawans in camp? There's a lot of different possible answers. One that I'm going to just throw out today is that even if people identified as Okinawan, the World War II incarceration experience in and of itself constructed them as Japanese, as ethnically Japanese. I think that's the end of my time, so I'll stop there. Thank you. I hope we can, again, continue this conversation in other venues and online in the comments. Please feel free to email me. And I'm going to close out our session by saying thank you to the organizers of the Memorial Pilgrimage. Thanks to Sho for organizing this panel. Thanks to all of our speakers, musician Joey, and it's been a pleasure. Thank you all for attending today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jane and Anne, for sharing your stories. I think it's really valuable to just see these family histories unfold in real time. And yeah, just to echo what Jane was ending with, I hope that this is the beginning of an uncovering of this, and will also allow us to sort of imagine, just to repeat this point one more time, but I really think that understanding how to engage with Indigenous histories on this continent is really crucial. And to do that in a historical context and a contemporary context and a future context, because those are all three things, Indigenous people are often deprived of past, future, and present. And so these are things that I hope we hold in our heart and begin to work through together collectively. And I think, it takes a lot of building relations, but it also takes a lot of listening and a lot of solitary work, and not necessarily thinking we know the answers or thinking we know how to proceed, but really humbling ourselves and moving past the facts, moving past trying to, asking whose land you're on is this intellectual process, and that's okay, but it has to be a spiritual process. It has to be an emotional process. So, Nihe Debiru, that's thank you, Nuchinaguchi, and I hope that we can just grow these conversations as we move forward.